The coffee was cold, the cup chipped, and the man sitting alone in the corner booth hadn't touched it in 20 minutes, but Emma Rodriguez noticed something far more alarming. His hands were trembling, his face pale as porcelain, and his breathing shallow and uneven. She didn't know he was Marcus Thornhill, one of the wealthiest men in the country, founder of a global tech empire, whose face had graced magazine covers and business headlines for 2 decades. All she saw was a human being in distress, and without hesitation, she crossed the half-empty diner, slid into the seat across from him, and spoke in the same gentle voice she used with her 7-year-old daughter when nightmares woke her. At 3 a.m., "Hey, I don't know what you're going through right now, but you're not alone, okay? Just breathe with me for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, for the next 6 minutes." As the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the smell of burnt toast hung in the air, Emma guided this stranger through a panic attack with nothing but her presence, her calm, and her unwavering humanity, never once asking who he was or what had brought him to this cracked vinyl booth in a forgotten corner of the city. When his breathing finally steadied and color returned to his cheeks, Marcus looked up at her with eyes that hadn't truly seen. Another person in years' eyes that had evaluated stock prices and business proposals and corporate acquisitions but had forgotten how to recognize genuine kindness and, before he could speak, Emma simply patted his hand, said "You're going to be okay," refilled his cold coffee with a fresh hot cup, and returned to her other tables as if she'd done nothing more extraordinary than take an order for pancakes. Marcus sat there for another hour, long after Emma's shift ended, watching her move through the diner with tired grace, noticing the way she remembered an elderly regular's preference for extra cream, how she slipped a free slice of pie to a teenager who was clearly counting coins, how she laughed with genuine joy at a toddler's babbling, even though exhaustion lined her face like a map of struggles he couldn't imagine. And something shifted in his chest. A crack in the carefully constructed armor he'd built around his heart after his wife's death 3 years ago, after success had become his only companion in wealth, his only measure of worth. He left a $100 bill under his coffee cup and walked out into the November rain, but he couldn't stop thinking about her, not in any romantic sense, but with the nagging feeling that this woman who served coffee for minimum wage plus tips possessed something he'd lost somewhere between his first million and his first billion, something more valuable than everything in his investment portfolio combined. The next morning, Marcus did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He canceled his meetings, cleared his schedule, and returned to the diner, this time not running from a panic attack triggered by the anniversary of his wife's death, but searching for answers to questions he was only beginning to formulate. Emma was there again, working the breakfast shift, and when she saw him, her face showed only warm recognition, no awe at his wealth, no calculation of what he might offer, just the same human concern she'd shown the night before. "Feeling better?" she asked, pouring him coffee without being asked, and Marcus found himself nodding, then doing something else he rarely did. He told the truth. "Thanks to you," he said, and then, because her kindness had opened something in him that couldn't easily close, he asked, "Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Emma glanced at the clock. Her shift ended in 10 minutes, and she had exactly 45 minutes before she needed to be at her second job, cleaning offices downtown. But something in this man's eyes, a loneliness, she recognized because she'd seen it in her own mirror. During the 2 years since her husband's car accident had left her a widow with a child to raise alone, made her nod and say, "I've got a few." They sat in that same corner booth, and Marcus asked about her life, and to her own surprise, Emma told him, not looking for sympathy or handouts, but simply because he asked like he actually wanted to know, how she'd been a nursing student before her husband died, how the medical bills and funeral costs had consumed their small savings, how she'd dropped out with only 1 semester remaining because she couldn't afford tuition and childcare and rent, how she now worked 3 jobs to keep her daughter Maya in their small apartment with heat and food and the occasional new book, how she'd long ago stopped dreaming about finishing her degree because survival didn't leave room for dreams. Marcus listened with an intensity that made Emma slightly uncomfortable, as if he was memorizing every word, and when she finished, he asked the question that had kept him awake all night. How do you do it? How do you have anything left to give to a stranger when you're carrying all of that? Emma was quiet for a long moment, stirring sugar into her own coffee, and when she answered, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Because somebody was kind to me once when I had nothing, and it kept me alive, literally kept me alive, during the darkest week of my life. And I promised myself that if I survived, I'd be that person for someone else whenever I could. Because kindness isn't something you can afford or not afford. It's something you choose, and it's the only thing that makes any of this bearable. Something in Marcus broke then, cleanly and completely, like ice cracking under spring sun, and tears he hadn't shed since his wife's funeral rolled down. His face right there in the diner while the breakfast crowd clattered silverware and called out orders and lived their lives, and Emma, without judgment or discomfort, simply handed him a napkin and waited. When he could speak again, Marcus told her his own truth, that he'd built an empire, but lost himself. That success had cost him his marriage even before death took his wife. That he had more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, but no one to share breakfast with. That he'd been sitting in this diner the night before, seriously contemplating whether a life of empty achievements was worth continuing, and that her simple act of human kindness had reminded him that the answer might be yes, if he could find his way back to what mattered. They talked for 2 hours, Emma calling in late to her second job for the first time in 18 months. And by the time they finally parted, something had shifted for both of them. Emma had been reminded that her kindness mattered, that she mattered, that the exhausting choice to remain open-hearted in a world that had been cruel was not weakness, but the truest form of strength. And Marcus had been given a glimpse of the man he used to be before wealth had isolated him behind walls of privilege and protection. What happened next unfolded over the following 3 months, and it wasn't what anyone might expect. Marcus didn't swoop in with a dramatic check or a fairy tale rescue, because his late wife had once told him that real generosity wasn't about making yourself feel powerful, but about honoring others' dignity, and he finally understood what she'd meant. Instead, he did his research, made some calls, and discovered that the nursing program Emma had attended was at a university where he'd endowed a scholarship fund years ago, a fund that had sat underutilized because the criteria had been too narrow, too focused on traditional students and perfect grades rather than people like Emma who had real-world experience and determination, but didn't fit conventional molds. He restructured the entire scholarship program, expanded it, renamed it after his late wife, and when he called Emma 3 weeks after their conversation, it wasn't to offer her charity, but to inform her that she'd been awarded the Catherine Thornhill Scholarship for non-traditional nursing students, which covered full tuition, provided a living stipend, and included child care services, and that there would be 20 more scholarships, just like it awarded each year to people whose circumstances had interrupted their dreams, but not their determination. Emma cried, and then she laughed. And then she said something that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. "You didn't have to do this for me." And his response came from the deepest truth he'd discovered. "I didn't do it for you." "I mean, yes, you're the first recipient, and that matters enormously to me, but I did it for me. Because you showed me that the only thing my wealth is actually good for is building bridges between people and their purpose. And I've wasted 3 years forgetting that." Emma returned to nursing school that January, and Marcus began the slow work of reconnecting with his own humanity, volunteering at the diner 1 morning a week, not as a billionaire performing charity, but as a person washing dishes and pouring coffee and learning the names and stories of people he would have walked past without seeing just months before. He and Emma became unlikely friends, their lives intersecting in ways that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with mutual respect and recognition. She reminded him to stay grounded, to measure success in moments of connection rather than quarterly earnings. And he reminded her that her dreams were worth pursuing, that survival and living could coexist, that accepting help wasn't weakness when it was offered with genuine respect. Maya, Emma's daughter, drew Marcus a picture of a superhero with a coffee pot, and he framed it in his office, where a Picasso had once hung. And somehow, that simple crayon drawing meant more to him than the artwork that had cost $6 million. The diner became a different place. Marcus quietly bought it when the owner faced bankruptcy. But instead of demolishing it for development as any rational investor would have done, he upgraded the kitchen, raised the staff's wages, added benefits, and kept it exactly what it had always been, a place where people of all kinds could sit in cracked vinyl booths and be served by people who saw them as human beings rather than transactions. On the day Emma graduated from nursing school, 18 months after their first conversation, Marcus sat in the audience next to Maya, cheering louder than anyone when Emma's name was called. And afterward, at the small celebration dinner Emma insisted on hosting in her still small, but now manageable apartment, he gave a toast that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with character, to Emma, who saved my life with nothing but kindness when I was too lost to even know I needed saving, and who has taught me that wealth isn't measured in what you have, but in what you give and who you choose to be when nobody's watching. Emma raised her glass of sparkling cider and responded with her own truth. And to Marcus, who showed me that accepting help with grace is just as important as offering it, and that sometimes the people we help end up saving us right back. In the years that followed, Emma became a nurse in the pediatric oncology ward, bringing the same grace and presence to frightened children and their families that she'd once brought to a broken billionaire in a corner booth. And Marcus transformed his entire approach to wealth, shifting from accumulation to circulation, from building walls to building bridges, funding scholarships and community centers and second chance programs with the same intensity he'd once brought to corporate acquisitions. But more importantly, he showed up, personally and consistently, to the work of being human among humans. They remained friends, these two people who should never have intersected, whose lives had been changed by a simple act of kindness that cost nothing but meant everything. And whenever Marcus felt himself slipping back into old patterns of isolation and empty achievement, he'd return to that diner, sit in that corner booth, and remember the night a minimum wage waitress had seen past his wealth and status to the suffering human beneath, and had offered the only thing that truly matters in this world, her compassionate presence and her generous heart. And whenever Emma felt overwhelmed by the suffering she witnessed in the hospital, by the impossible weight of caring so deeply in a world that often seemed designed to break open hearts, she'd remember that her choice to remain kind, despite her own pain, had literally saved a life and sparked a ripple of generosity that had changed hundreds of other lives through scholarships and opportunities and second chances. And she'd find the strength to keep choosing compassion, keep choosing connection, keep choosing to see the human being in front of her rather than looking away. The coffee cup from that first night chipped and ordinary sat on Marcus's desk in his office, a reminder that the most valuable things can't be bought or sold, only given and received, and that sometimes the simplest act by the most unlikely person in the most unremarkable moment can change absolutely everything, not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through the quiet, revolutionary power of one human being choosing to see another human being and saying, simply and profoundly, "You're not alone."